In a remote town near the top of the world, there's a law that sounds impossible. You are not allowed to die here. Not because anyone will stop you from taking your last breath, but because when you do, something else refuses to stop. Your body won't decay. It won't return to the earth. It will simply wait, preserved in ice, for decades, maybe centuries. This is the town where death itself has been outlawed. Welcome to Longyearbyen, the northernmost town on Earth, closer to the North Pole than to Oslo. A place where polar bears outnumber people, where the sun vanishes for 4 months straight, and where, officially, since 1950, you cannot be buried. But why would a government actually ban death? What happens to the people who die here anyway? Where do their bodies go? And what secret, buried decades ago beneath this frozen ground, forced officials to write this law in the first place? The answer involves a global pandemic, a graveyard frozen in time, and a discovery that terrified scientists. To understand it, we have to go back to the birth of this town and the disease that never left it. To understand why death was outlawed here, you have to understand why anyone came to this frozen rock in the first place. In the early 1900s, Svalbard wasn't a nation, it was a no man's land. No government owned it, no laws applied, and beneath its ice sat something valuable enough to lure men from across Europe: coal. American businessman John Munro Longyear arrived in 1906, and where he planted his flag, a town rose in his name, Longyearbyen. Miners came by the hundreds, Norwegian, Russian, Swedish, men chasing wages in a place with no sunlight for a third of the year, and temperatures that could kill an unprepared man in minutes. Life here was brutal. Coal dust filled the lungs. Avalanches buried entire camps without warning. And when a man died, and men died often, there was only one place to put him: the small cemetery at the edge of town, dug into permafrost, ground that stays frozen year-round, sometimes hundreds of meters deep. Then, in 1918, something arrived that made even the harshest Arctic winter look merciful. World War I was ending. Soldiers were coming home, and traveling with them, silently, was the deadliest pandemic in modern history, the Spanish flu. It didn't just strike the trenches of Europe. It reached ships. It reached ports. And in October of that year, it reached Longyearbyen. The town had no real hospital, no isolation ward, no way to stop what was coming. Within weeks, healthy young miners, men in their 20s and 30s, the strongest workers in the settlement, began collapsing. Fever, exhaustion, lungs filling with fluid. The infirmary overflowed. There weren't enough beds, so the sick were laid on floors, in hallways, wherever there was space. One by one, they died. 7 of them, in a matter of weeks. Some sources suggest more. And in the panic of a mining town, facing an invisible killer they didn't understand, there was no time for elaborate funerals. The bodies were wrapped, carried to the cemetery, and lowered into the permafrost. The ground closed over them, and the town moved on, the way towns had to back then, because the mine still needed coal, and grief was a luxury few could afford. Nobody thought about those graves again for almost 70 years. The dead were dead. The ground had taken them. Case closed. Except permafrost doesn't work the way normal soil does. It doesn't decompose. It doesn't return a body to the earth the way burial is supposed to. Instead, it freezes everything in place, flesh, fabric, and anything living inside it, and holds it there, suspended, waiting. Nobody in 1918 could have known what that meant. But in 1998, a team of scientists were about to find out, and what they discovered beneath that quiet cemetery would terrify the entire world. In 1998, a team of researchers arrived in Longyearbyen with a question that sounded almost like science fiction. Could the 1918 Spanish flu virus still be alive, frozen inside the bodies buried 80 years earlier? The theory wasn't crazy. Permafrost is nature's freezer. It doesn't just slow decay. In the right conditions, it can stop it almost entirely. Scientists had already found woolly mammoths preserved in Siberian ice for thousands of years, skin and fur still intact. If permafrost could do that to a mammoth, what could it do to a virus small enough to survive inside frozen tissue? The team, led by researchers including a British scientist tracing the genetic secrets of the 1918 pandemic, requested permission to exhume the graves of the 7 miners who died in October 1918. This was no small request. It meant disturbing the dead, digging into a cemetery that families and the town had left untouched for generations. Permission was eventually granted, under strict conditions. This wouldn't be a simple excavation. It would be closer to a biohazard operation. Why? Because the fear wasn't just historical curiosity. The 1918 flu had killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide. Some estimates run even higher, more than the death toll of the First World War itself. If even a trace of that virus survived, intact, and was accidentally released during excavation, the consequences were almost unthinkable. So the scientists suited up like they were walking into a nuclear site. Full protective gear, sealed containment tents erected directly over the grave sites, air filtration systems running constantly. Every layer of soil removed was treated as though it might be lethal. As they dug deeper, the permafrost told its own story. The soil right at the surface had thawed and refrozen repeatedly over 80 years. Not ideal for preservation. But as the team went deeper, the ground grew colder, denser, more stable. And that's when tensions in the scientific community began to split into 2 camps. One side believed this dig could unlock the genetic blueprint of history's deadliest pandemic, information that could help researchers understand how influenza viruses mutate and how to defend against the next global outbreak. To them, this was one of the most important virological missions in modern history. The other side was terrified they were about to make a catastrophic mistake. Critics warned that even attempting to revive fragments of a virus responsible for tens of millions of deaths was playing with fire. What if the virus wasn't fully deactivated by decades in the ice? What if a containment breach, however small, let something escape into a world that had no immunity to a 100-year-old strain? Some scientists outside the project called for it to be halted entirely. But the dig continued. Layer after layer, the team worked in near silence inside those sealed tents, thousands of miles from the nearest major hospital, on top of the world, holding tools that might be about to unearth the deadliest biological artifact of the 20th century. Then, finally, at a depth where the permafrost had remained a stable frozen tomb for 8 decades, they reached the coffins. And what they found inside would either make history or become one of the most dangerous mistakes modern science had ever made. The coffins were opened, carefully, inside the sealed tent. And what the scientists found inside was both remarkable and deeply unsettling. The bodies weren't perfectly preserved. 80 years, even in permafrost, had taken some toll. But there was more soft tissue remaining than almost anyone expected. Organs, lung tissue. The exact material the researchers needed to search for fragments of the virus that had killed these men. Samples were taken with extreme care, sealed in specialized containers, and prepared for transport to high-security laboratories. The excavation itself, remarkably, went off without incident. No breach, no outbreak. The nightmare scenario that critics had feared never happened. The town above continued about its quiet Arctic life, mostly unaware of the tension that had unfolded beneath that patch of snow. But the real story was only beginning, because now, those tissue samples had to be analyzed. And back in laboratories in the UK and the United States, virologists began the painstaking work of searching for genetic fragments of a virus that hadn't been seen in living form in 8 decades. What they eventually found reshaped modern virology. Fragments of RNA from the 1918 influenza strain were recovered, not just from the Svalbard samples, but combined with other frozen specimens found elsewhere, including an Alaskan permafrost burial site. Piece by piece, like assembling a shattered puzzle, scientists began reconstructing the genetic sequence of the deadliest pandemic in modern history. The findings were staggering. This wasn't just any flu strain. The 1918 virus carried mutations that made it uniquely lethal, able to trigger a runaway immune overreaction in young, healthy adults, which explained why it killed so many people in the prime of their lives, not just the elderly and the very young. For the first time, nearly a century later, science understood why the Spanish flu had been so catastrophic. And that understanding came directly from a graveyard that had been sealed in silence since 1918. A graveyard the town of Longyearbyen had never dared touch. Once word of the discovery spread, officials in Svalbard made a decision that would define the town forever. If frozen ground could preserve a decades-old pandemic well enough for scientists to extract its genetic code, what else might still be lying in wait beneath the ice? The cemetery was closed permanently to new burials, and soon after, an extraordinary law followed, one that would make headlines around the world for its strangeness, without ever fully explaining the fear behind it. Here's what most headlines got wrong about Longyearbyen. The story spread across the internet as a quirky, almost funny fact. It's illegal to die in this town. People shared it as trivia, a strange little curiosity about a frozen place at the top of the world. But that framing hides the real twist, because it was never actually illegal to die there. No one has ever been arrested for dying. No law punishes death itself. What actually happened is far stranger and far more revealing about how fear spreads once it's rooted in real science. What Svalbard actually did was ban new burials in the town cemetery permanently after the 1998 discovery confirmed that permafrost could preserve dangerous pathogens for generations. That's a very different thing than banning death, but it's a distinction that got lost the moment the story went viral. And here's the twist within the twist. Even that burial ban wasn't purely about the Spanish flu. Local officials revealed something else, something even stranger. The permafrost itself is changing. For decades, Svalbard's frozen ground was assumed to be permanent, stable enough to trust with the dead for 1,000 years. But climate change is thawing the Arctic faster than almost anywhere else on the planet. Longyearbyen's permafrost, once reliably frozen year-round, has begun shifting, melting in places, becoming unpredictable, which means the very thing that once preserved a deadly pandemic in perfect stasis is now unstable, potentially releasing whatever it's been holding on to, whether that's old diseases, unstable ground beneath buildings, or worse. So the real reason you can't be buried in Longyearbyen isn't a strange bureaucratic quirk. It's a two-part warning written in law. First, that the ground remembers everything it's given, and second, that the ground itself can no longer be trusted to keep those secrets locked away. Today, when someone dies in Longyearbyen, their body is flown off the island entirely to mainland Norway, hundreds of miles south, where normal burial and decomposition can safely occur. But there's one more layer to this story, one more detail that officials rarely bring up, because it's the part that should worry you the most. Here's the detail that rarely makes it into the viral posts. Longyearbyen's cemetery didn't just hold 7 flu victims. It holds dozens of graves, miners, families, children, going back over a century. Every single one of those bodies sits in the same permafrost, now proven capable of preserving pathogens across generations. Nobody has exhumed the rest. Nobody knows exactly what else might still be down there, waiting in ground that used to be a vault and is slowly becoming a question mark. And that's the quiet horror underneath this story. We tend to think of the past as something settled, buried, literally and figuratively, safely behind us. Longyearbyen proves that isn't always true. Sometimes the past doesn't decompose. It doesn't fade. It waits, frozen mid-moment, for the conditions to change enough to let it out again. A century ago, grieving miners lowered their friends into ground they trusted to hold them forever. They had no way of knowing that same ground would one day force scientists into hazmat suits, rewrite the science of pandemics, and outlast the very climate that made it reliable in the first place. Longyearbyen didn't outlaw death. It outlawed forgetting. It built a law around the idea that some things we bury, diseases, mistakes, history itself, don't truly disappear. They just wait for the ice to melt. And as the Arctic warms faster than anywhere else on Earth, that ice is melting whether we're ready or not. The real question isn't why you can't be buried in a small Norwegian town. It's what else, all over the frozen world, is waiting quietly beneath our feet for its turn to resurface. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the ground beneath one small Arctic town could hold a secret like this for 80 years, what else is out there, frozen and waiting, that we haven't found yet? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if strange laws born from real history are your thing, stick around, because our next story dives into a hidden secret even darker than this one.